Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope you're going to be able to see all the graphs and stuff that I have. Okay, so obviously everybody knows what theory of mind is, but I guess just to give the sort of research description of theory of mind. So when I talk about theory of mind, what I really mean is basically an understanding or an ability to predict other people's actions according to knowledge about their mental state. So for example, their intentions, their beliefs and their desires. Now, the sort of research on theory of mind that people are probably familiar with is the literature over the last sort of 50 years or so, where there's been a massive amount of research conducted in developmental psychology, looking at the sort of developmental trajectory of theory of mind abilities in children. And in particular, they would highlight the fact that children develop the ability to successfully pass theory of mind tasks between the ages of about 3 and 5 years old. But that there are these sort of existing precursors to fully fledged theory of mind that exist even before that. So, for example, even from about 6 months old, children start following other people's gaze, so engaging in joint attention. 12 months, proto-declarative pointing, so pointing to an object in the environment to draw someone else's attention to something that they want or that they want them to look at. And another important step along this trajectory of theory of mind development is children's ability then to distinguish between animate and inanimate objects. And that emerges as being really important because it shows then that they're aware of other people or other beings as being intentional agents, so having their own independent thoughts, desires and intentions. Now, there's a whole range of tasks that have been used to look at theory of mind, particularly in the developmental literature. Most of these have relied on sort of response-based tasks, so asking children explicitly to respond to different sorts of situations. And one of the most popular theory of mind tasks is the false belief task. So everybody's heard about this task. Basically, you're introduced to characters, Sally and Anne. Sally has a marble and she puts it in her basket. While she leaves the room, her friend Anne moves the marble into a box. And then children at the end of this story are asked to respond to a series of questions that either prompt them to infer Sally's false belief. So, for example, where will Sally look for her marble? Or to just recall something from the narrative reality. So, where is it in reality? Now, all the literature on the developmental aspects of theory of mind show that typically developing children show ability in this task around the age of 4 years old, so they start passing this test. And it's been suggested that children who fail this task do so because of severe interference from basically their own egocentric perspective. So they have difficulty inhibiting what they know to be able to infer Sally's own perspective. Now, one of the difficulties with this sort of task, obviously, with adults, is everybody answers this question correctly. So it would seem then that as healthy adults, we can do all these tasks very easily. But it's been emerging more and more this sort of difference between these sort of implicit and explicit measures of theory of mind or perspective-taking ability. And in fact, even in the developmental literature, there's using these sort of implicit ways to tap into ability to make inferences from these sort of situations, theory of mind situations. Children, even as young as 18 months, are actually implicitly able to understand that other people have different mental states. So, for example, in this study by Buttleman and colleagues, they basically made use of the fact that children are sort of active helpers. They want to help other people. And in their task, what they did was a sort of standard false belief task, but this time they had an experimenter who put an object into a box. They either left the room or they stayed in the room, and another experimenter moved the object to a new location. And what then happened was that the first experimenter comes back in and tries to open the first box, so the box they put the object into. And what they found was that when the experimenter had witnessed this object being moved, then the child came to help and helped them open that box that they were trying to open. But the really interesting thing was that if the first experimenter had missed it, so they'd been outside the room, the children actually went to the other box. So they made the inference that this experimenter is trying to get into the box to get the object out. They want the object, and it's over here, and so they get the object out that way. There's also more evidence from Senju and colleagues actually using eye tracking, where they have shown that children are able to refer to their own experience, in this case to their experience of wearing a pair of goggles that were either opaque or completely see-through, and actually then use that experience to infer what other people would know. So in this case, if children had tried on this pair of goggles that they couldn't see through, they then understood that the experimenter couldn't see when the object was moved, and therefore made their anticipatory eye movements towards the false belief location. In the conditions where the children had been given a pair of goggles to try on but they could see through, then they didn't make that false belief inference. They knew the person had seen the object get moved. There's also evidence from the sort of developmental literature that actually the social brain continues to develop throughout adolescence and actually all the way up to sort of early 20s. So for example, in Sarah Jane Blakemore's lab, they've shown in a range of different sort of social interaction or social understanding tasks that activity in the medial prefrontal cortex decreases between adolescence and adulthood when participants are engaged in these sorts of social understanding. So for example, understanding irony, emotional situations that evoke things like guilt or embarrassment and things like that. So basically there's this evidence that by using these more sensitive implicit measures you can get a much finer grained information about perspective taking abilities and the sorts of interference that people might suffer from. So like I said, as healthy adults, it feels as though taking someone else's perspective is relatively effortless, that we can do this every day, we do it every time we encounter another person. But actually psychological evidence has been revealing that actually taking someone else's perspective is not as easy as just simply reflecting on your own, and that when we take someone else's perspective actually it's cognitively demanding, so it requires some sort of cognitive effort, and that often we suffer interference from what we know from our own egocentric perspective. There's even some researchers that suggest that actually these theory of mind reasoning activations are only shown in under specific task constraints, so when we're explicitly told to keep track of someone else's perspective. So my approach then is to look at theory of mind, look at perspective taking through language, and there are several reasons for that. I guess the first and most important one is that my research training was all in psycholinguistics, in language comprehension, and that involved tools such as using eye tracking and reading, eye tracking visual worlds, ERPs, so really getting some idea about the fine-grained incremental nature of language comprehension. And when you look at the sort of bigger theory of mind and perspective-taking literature, while there's been a massive amount of research done among psychologists, very little of that research has actually looked at these sort of fine-grained time cores that people are actually able to take other people's perspectives or even switch between different perspectives when they're understanding social interactions. So the great thing then about coming at perspective taking from a psycholinguistic approach is that the tools are already available to be able to do these things. The second reason then to study theory of mind with language is that fMRI evidence has shown that there are overlapping patterns of brain activity when people are engaging in some sort of theory of mind process, when they're taking someone else's perspective, and when they're simply comprehending high-level language structures. So when people are having to understand high-level language structures, particularly those that require some sort of coherence of information, so for example sentence, story comprehension or logical reasoning, then a similar sort of network of brain areas are activated as is shown in theory of mind processing. So basically the question is whether there are related processes or cognitive processes that underlie each of these, and hopefully then using these different measures we can actually separate out the parts of the cognitive processes that are involved more generally in sort of high-level language comprehension and those that are specifically related to these sort of social inferences that we need to make about mental states. Okay, so all of the work that I'm going to talk about today is using the visual world paradigm, although in my research I've used other methods as well. But I just thought I'd give you a bit of a background to visual world research. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, visual world research is basically a task where participants are shown an image and the eye movements around that visual scene are analysed closely time-locked then to some auditory input, some related story. So, for example, in this commonly referred to study by Jerry Altman and Yuki Kimidi, participants are shown a picture on the screen which includes, in this case, a boy and a cake, as well as other objects. And they hear either the boy will move the cake or the boy will eat the cake. So what they found in their study was that participants were faster to move towards the cake in the eat condition than the move condition, because obviously the semantics of the word eat predict something edible, and therefore eat, the cake is the only thing there. But more interesting than that was that participants actually were able to anticipate reference to the cake, so they looked towards the cake even before it had been mentioned in the auditory story. So basically that means that the visual world paradigm is a brilliant paradigm to use to look at people's evolving expectations or anticipations about forthcoming reference, and basically the actions or behaviours that people are expecting other people to refer to or to engage in. Okay, so basically this visual world paradigm and its application to perspective taking has actually been growing in interest among psycholinguists in the last sort of 10 years or so. And particularly most of these researchers have been interested in how people use perspective to make sense of what we call referentially ambiguous expressions. So for example, somebody referring to the cup, when actually there are two cups present in the scene, but maybe only one of them is visible to the speaker. So the idea then is that by taking the speaker's perspective, it helps you narrow down to locate the actual which one of those two cups that person must be speaking about. So most of the early work, so done by Bas-Relief and colleagues, suggested that actually when participants are engaging in this sort of referential ambiguity tasks, that they are initially egocentric in their understanding. So basically they initially anchor their understanding of these ambiguous descriptions according to their own knowledge, and only later do they then start to accommodate the other person's perspective. So according to that model, taking someone else's perspective is not then a default process during communication, but it's something which is only activated as a sort of secondary process and according to need. So, for example, to resolve some sort of confusion in conversation. So, evidence that Kazar's egocentric adjustment model comes from these sorts of what they call reference assignment tasks. So the idea is that the participant is engaged in a game with either an on-screen avatar or a real-life person, usually some sort of confederate. And the idea is that they're presented with this array of objects, and the speaker will give them instructions to move those objects around the grid. Now, importantly, some of these grid spaces are occluded from the speaker's but not the listener's point of view. So on a critical instruction then, the speaker might ask the participant to move the bucket to the left, and that participant then needs to decide which of these two buckets they can be talking about. Now if you use perspective, you should be able to narrow down to know it must be this one, which is in a shared view of both the speaker and the listener, because the speaker can't see this one, therefore they shouldn't be referring to that. So according to the egocentric adjustment model, people really just can't help but consider this as an option as well as this, so that they show no bias. In contrast, I guess more recent research looking at the time course of perspective taking actually takes a different view, and it would say that when we're understanding language, actually it's a fully interactive process, and that when we're understanding these sorts of instructions, people are able to simultaneously make use of a whole range of different cues from the language input, and one of those is the speaker's perspective. So according to this model then, we should be able to use someone's perspective to interpret what they're saying in the earliest moments of processing. So some of the early evidence comes from, for example, when linguistic cues are available to help the participant narrow down the sort of choice of objects that they might be referring to. So to have a relevant contrast set using scalar adjectives such as small, or also even colours. But even more striking are the early effects, early expectation effects that have been shown when participants are actively engaged in a question and answer discourse with the other person. So what that does then is that by asking particular questions, it explicitly establishes what the speaker does and doesn't know, so it helps direct the listener to these sort of hidden information. So evidence for this sort of take comes from this sort of design where participants might be asked what's above the, and here then the target would be the banana because there's something above it which is hidden. So basically asking the question what's above implies that the speaker doesn't know something and they're looking for some hidden information. Okay, so I guess yeah.
But that's true of the hamburger.
There's nothing hidden. Okay. Maybe that's just my sort of way I've made up this grid, but yeah. I maybe say because Sorry, it's touchscreen, forgot you said that. So in this one, what's above the, well, there's nothing here. Yeah, you're right. This is just, I locked this up as an example. I don't know that this is how they actually do it. I don't want to. Okay, so I guess the sort of central question in my research then is to sort of take on board these sort of existing literature from psycholinguistics and to ask basically whether observers are sensitive to perspectives online. And I guess I'm more interested in more sort of discourse level situations where people might need to infer someone else's perspective. So, for example, I'm interested in asking whether how listeners use knowledge about others, and I'm particularly interested in these predictions that people make about other people's actions or behaviours. And I'm interested in questions such as how automatic these processes are, whether they suffer any interference from reality or their own egocentric perspective. Is there any evidence, for example, that in order to take someone else's perspective, you have to suppress your own knowledge, and is there any sort of cognitive effort involved in any of these tasks? Okay, so I guess the first study that I did on this actually wasn't the first study, it was one of very many that I did as part of my PhD, but the first one that actually worked was one that we did using this visual world paradigm, and it was very basic design where we literally sort of presented participants with these sorts of false belief stories, so narratives that involved a false belief where either John was away somewhere else when the object got moved, or he was watching whilst it got moved. And what we found was that participants were rapidly able to update basically information according to the other person's perspective. So when they got to this part, so he looked on they were able to direct their visual attention according to the perspective appropriate location, and then therefore they showed no interference from their own perspective when they were predicting continuations. Okay, so in the next experiment, what I was really interested in doing, and this was stuff that I did at UCL, we were interested in sort of making this false belief task a bit more ecologically valid. And so what we did was that we put people into a sort of fully interactive false belief scenario. And the setup then was that we had two participants who each watched videos on these computer monitors in front of them. They were just really boring videos of a person behind a table moving objects into various boxes, and the participant's task was to either describe what happened in the video to the other person or to listen to the other person's description while they were watching everything on screen. So basically we were recording the descriptions that were provided by the speaker and the eye movements of the person who was listening and looking at these images. Importantly, there were a couple of twists in the design. So firstly, this person here, the person who was randomly allocated to the speaker, was actually a Confederate. And in fact, they weren't watching any videos at all on a computer monitor. They were simply reading off instructions, or reading off descriptions that we had on the computer monitor in front of them. And the only reason we did that was to make sure there was consistency between the words and the description types that people were using, obviously for later analysis. The other twist was that on half the trials, halfway through the video, a screen would come down to cover the speaker's computer monitor, so that the listener thought that they were only watching half of the video. So basically what that did is it sort of created this disparity between what the speaker knew and what the listener knew. So on half the trials, the listener holds some privileged information which is not held by the person who's giving the description of what happened. Okay, so this is basically the design on an individual trial. So all trials, the video starts with two objects in the centre of the table and two possible target locations, so boxes labelled A and B. In the first half of the video then, the person lifts one of those objects and puts it into one of the boxes and closes the lid.
What is it?
It's an umbrella in that case. Yeah. They were always different, it was just random stuff. In the second part of the video then, one of two things happened. So either the person lifted the object out of that box and just replaced it back into the same box, or they lifted it out of the initial box and moved it into the second box. Okay? So basically we had this no move state, so it just stayed the same, and then a move state. So to set up the different perspectives, the screen came down partway through this second video, so that only the listener knew what happened in that second part of the video. So basically what that means is that in the no-move state, the speaker's description is going to be at odds with the listener's knowledge of what actually happened. Okay? No, sorry, it's not going to be at odds, regardless of whether the screen come down or not. When it had moved location, then the speaker's description will be at odds with the listener's understanding of what happened. So at the end of each video, they were then presented with a still frame from the last scene in the video, and they then listened, the participants were eye-tracked whilst they looked at this scene, and they listened to the speaker's description of what happened. So in this case, the umbrella is in box, and we'll say A or B. So basically what we're interested in seeing is whether participants would be able to appropriately use the speaker's sometimes limited perspective to be able to predict what they will actually say, so looking at one or two boxes, or whether they would suffer interference from what they know themselves and just show this egocentric bias. Okay, so the design was that we tested a total of 40 participants, each paired with one of two confederates, the University of Cambridge. Everybody took part in the same 20 experimental videos rotated across 4 different lists alongside 56 fillers. So basically we crossed movement with the knowledge, so whether they knew everything or they didn't. At the end of the experiment, both participants took part in this sort of debrief part where they had to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 basically their belief in the design, so whether they thought the person was a confederate or not. And as you can see, everybody was completely fooled, and actually when you revealed to them at the end, some of them were quite upset. The next day I actually had one of them email me, and she'd been completely shocked. She had no idea that this had been a confederate until the next day she emailed me with a bullet point list of things that might have given it away, which included things like she looked too confident with the microphone. So I think she was just trying to reason with herself how she could have missed it. Okay, so to analyse the data, what we do is that we coded then the temporal locations of the fixations every 20 milliseconds for each condition. We then calculated the probability that participants would look at either the reality box, where the object really is, or the alternative as a function of time, and we used a log ratio measure. And to do our statistical analyses, we coded the onsets and offsets of every word in every trial participant and condition, and used word-based regions of analysis for our statistical analysis.
Why did you do a log analysis?
Why log rather than just the raw probabilities? Because they're unbounded, the probability 0 and 1. So sometimes you do have a total 0, and we wanted to have this central around 0. So basically what we end up with here is a sort of a single value which includes both these probabilities, which is centered around 0, so that anything that's positive shows a bias to the reality, anything negative is a bias to alternative. So it also then allows us to test the strength of the biases towards one or the other. Okay, so I'll just very quickly explain how this is plotted. So we've got on the y-axis here the bias to either of these two boxes. So as I say, anything that's up the way from the central line is a bias to the reality box, anything down is the alternative. And then we have time here, which is synced at these different onsets of the words in the auditory input. So what we find firstly was that throughout the time series there was a main effect of movement. So basically what that means is that when the object had previously been in another location, it basically weakened the strength of the bias to the reality box. So basically participants having knowledge of that object being somewhere else sort of interfered with their knowledge of where it is now. Importantly, we also found a main effect of knowledge which emerged from the onset of the object onwards, and that was basically where if the two participants had actually shared knowledge about the object's location, they showed a significantly stronger bias towards the reality box than if the listener had privileged knowledge about that. So basically showing that in the earliest moments of processing, participants are using the person's perspective to sort of direct their visual attention around the scene.
Just before we go any further,
Yeah.
can I just clear this graph up here
Yes.
that we're looking at? On that y-axis there,
Yeah.
it was 0 to 5, right?
Yeah.
So what would be the mean probabilities here? Is it always going to be, would all of those probabilities add up to 1?
So in this case, the log probabilities, unfortunately, they don't relate directly to the normal raw probabilities. It's just because basically they end up so big because there's so few looks towards the alternative. It's just the way that they sort of play off each other.
But what I'm trying to get at, if you go back a slide or two, one slide, that's it.
That one.
Yeah, so...
So they don't add up to one because there's also all this other stuff.
Other places,
Yeah, so we've just used these bits, but obviously the probability of each, there could be a whole lot. I mean, usually this is all they look at, but...
That's what I'm really trying to get a grip of is, you know, most 85% of the time they looked at box A and 12% of the time they looked at box B, and that leaves 3% of the time where they were looking at the keys or the bit of the black of the box. Is that about right?
Yes.
So what would those percentages be about?
I don't know. Off the top of my head. Of how much they look at the background.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get is a grasp of. So for example, if you go to your next slide, so if that next slide there comprises of 12% looks at A, 6% looks at B, and 82% looks at nonsense, then I'm not impressed with it. But if it corresponds to 96% of the time they were looking at A or B, then I'm impressed with it.
It is pretty much 90% of the time they're
That's
looking
fine.
at A or B, but I can't say the values on
No, that's okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
As long as it, you know, as long as it's that they were looking at A or B most of the time.
Yeah, I mean actually in these sort of more realistic videos, I guess it's maybe, I don't know, slightly lower than if we just use the very stand like in these ones, because there's nothing in the background, they only really ever look at the actual objects.
There's also a positive effect, right? Like if you go back to the other ones with the 3 pictures, that was probably free viewing anyway.
Yes, that was just
so then you get, with free viewing, you also get like these, I completely agree with your comment, by the way. With free viewing experiments, you can sometimes get a significant effect, but it's actually only 6% of the time.
That's
The
exactly
majority are
right.
looking all over the shop.
Your average
you have more like a task.
Your average visual will study will get a difference of probably 6%. I raised it with Jerry at ECM, 6%.
I was very happy with that.
Yeah, and the effect will be driven by a difference between 12 and 18%, which means that 82% of the time they're not doing anything to do with this at all.
Okay, well, I would say at least 80% of the time they're looking at these things, at least.
Also the fact that you ask questions make it a different task.
Yeah, I mean the other thing is that the time frames that we're looking at are actually fairly small, and they are directed to look at one of these things. So yeah, I can send you them all probably if you're interested.
Not like
Do you not like? Okay. Okay. So the other thing that we found was that there was an interaction between movement and knowledge. So when we followed this up using simple main effects, what we find is that when the object was moved to a different location in that second part of the video, participants showed a significantly weaker bias to the reality box when they had privileged knowledge about that movement compared to when they both knew about that movement. In contrast then, when the object wasn't moved, there was no significant difference between shared and privileged knowledge trials. The other interesting thing to note is that in this sort of, I guess what you would call the real false belief trial, so when the object was moved but it was privileged, that movement was privileged knowledge to just the listener, what you find is that although they show significantly reduced bias to the reality box, they actually haven't fully taken on the person's perspective. So they've not actually anticipated reference to the alternative box. And we can sort of quantify that by looking at one sample t-tests that compare this bias to the zero, no bias line, and at no point do they actually show prediction or even increased looks towards that location. Okay, so I guess the summary then, what we would say is that taken together the results argue against an initial egocentric bias in perspective taking, so they don't seem to show that people initially take the reality and then later have to correct that. So instead we would say then that perspective taking seems to be spontaneous and occurs very rapidly, that people are using these perspectives immediately from the onset of the object to understand the description. And the interesting thing here is then that people are doing this spontaneously in this task with no reason to do so. So it's not that they have been explicitly told to keep track of the other person's perspective, and they don't have a reason to do so. So the fact that they're sort of spontaneously sensitive to this is quite interesting. But, of course, what we do show is that there is interference from reality. So the fact that they don't significantly predict this alternative box in that false belief condition suggests that there is some sort of pull of reality or egocentric bias. And basically, there's sort of two possibilities to explain that. Firstly, it could be that people have a difficulty in either constructing or accessing these non-actual representations, so thinking about what the person knows that is not actually true, or it could just be this competition from reality representations, so having two representations of what you know and what someone else knows that are just competing with each other. And what we would say then is that it's more likely to be this second one, so it's more likely to be down to competition, because perspective is influencing their behaviour, their visual biases as a sort of main effect. So it can't just be the case that they're not able to set up these, because they are doing something different. It's just that they're suffering this sort of competition from the alternative. Okay, so in this third experiment, what we're interested in was to actually look more closely at the actual task constraints. So, as I've described in the sort of previous psycholinguistic research that's used these sort of referential ambiguity tasks versus my sort of discourse tasks, I was interested in seeing how actually being involved in a task influences the time course or your ability to actually take someone's perspective. So one of the questions I was asking was basically, what is the role of the self in the task? So if you're actively involved in that task and are given an explicit reason to use their perspective, does that make you better at doing it? And the other thing that I was asking was basically what happens then if you have some reinforcing cues that actually help you make that perspective inference. So what we're interested in here was trying to sort of reduce the cognitive load of perspective taking by having available these cues. So what we were measuring here was we had a range of different measures that were able to look at both explicit and implicit measures of perspective taking, and particularly here we're interested in the sort of cognitive effort. So firstly then we could look at the time course, so these implicit anticipating eye movements towards the visual objects on the screen. We were also able to explicitly measure behavioural responses, because in this task we actually had some of our participants explicitly respond according to either false belief or true belief. So we had reaction times and error rates. And lastly, we also looked at the implicit measure of cognitive load from pupil diameter. And this is based on sort of emerging cognitive research that suggests that there's a correlation between pupil diameter and cognitive effort in the task.
What machine did you use for it?
This is all iLink.
How did you get people to be able to measure like that?
Up the iLink.
Yeah.
Comes with it.
Default. I know it comes defaultly, only for a stable central fixation. I'm absolutely certain of this.
Really?
Yeah, that's what we're going to do it.
I've been doing
We don't want
I know you'll get a number out, but it won't reflect pupil diameter.
What does it reflect?
You've got to keep your eye stable in the middle. So if you move about,
So if you move,
it changes the image of the eye on the basis of which pupil diameter is computed, changes just through the positioning of the eye. I'm absolutely certain.
How would you contract that in another
You
machine?
can't. So the point is that if you want to do accurate pupillometry work, you have to have a central fixation, constant central fixation.
But
And also there's another question I've got, which is that the time course of that pupillometry stuff, my understanding, based on the limited literature that I know, is that it's quite, you know, it takes a long time to show up. 200
milliseconds to peak amplitude.
Is that right? Are you absolutely certain of that? Because I know some people that would dispute that. I mean, I haven't read the literature myself, but it's just that I am working with some people on this.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on it, because at the moment it's just a sort of extra thing that we had the data in there and we thought, well, interesting to measure it.
So we were thinking of
and I
the same
have read
thing.
the same thing about eyes moving, but I mean, we have condition effects that I don't know how that are as we would predict, and I don't know how you could expect. So basically what we've done is we haven't looked at pupil diameter over time, we've done the average across that whole trial, basically.
But the way the eye looks at the screen in the corner, that would be a systematic variation.
Well, it depends what they're doing. I don't know what she's going to do, right? But
It's a head fixed, of course. Right?
yeah. But what I'm saying is, if you unless I am very seriously mixed up, and I might be, it certainly happens, we contacted Ireland about this and talked to them, and what they said was, you've got to keep them central, otherwise there's artifacts in the data. Now you might be extracting them, I just don't know.
I mean, the thing is, I don't know. I mean, we had to go because there's literature about both ways. There are papers out there that have done, I guess, similar things that have taken it an average over a period of time. There's new ones coming out now. I mean, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but there's like 2011. There are brand new things that are coming out, and there are people that have looked more closely at this sort of temporal. I mean, which is also influenced by, I guess, whether you preceded it with a white screen and then you have a dark picture and all sorts of things like that.
But I understand that as well, but you're talking about cognitive load, right? Yeah. This is very interesting anyway. I mean, I don't mean to interrupt the talk at all. No. I wanted to know how much work you've done, legwork, to check out whether that measures you're happy with it. It sounds like you've done about as much as we have, which is not too much, but enough for you to think, okay, we could have a go at this, and it's there for free. I'm a bit worried that the island just delivers the information for free, and people are going, oh, well, we'll have that then, and then they're correlating it without actually. So have you done anything like a calibration where you validate the
normalised?
Yes, something like that. That's what I was thinking. That's what we were thinking of doing as a check before we actually embarked on this. But I recommend to you, at the very least, because you put it under review, so I assume it's out there, and I guess I would say it might be worth just dropping them an email, the Ireland guys. Yeah. Because I'm the Ireland 1000, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's an issue anyway. But I'm not saying it's wrong, right? And it could well be that you've got these consistency effects, or your averaging procedure deals with it. But I was right up for doing something with reading. Yeah. And it quickly became apparent that what I had planned was not going to be possible.
We can talk about it, I guess, when I show you the results for it, but there are effects in there to give away what I've found. Yeah, so I'll continue and then we can come back to it then. Okay, so that's what we're interested in looking at. Okay, so basically the experimental procedure, I guess, in some ways was similar to the last study, but this time it was just individual participants that were being tested while they were watching these videos on screen. So in this case then we had the videos that started with two characters, so two actors on screen. They were introduced as Jane and Sarah, and one of these just watched what the other one was doing, and the other one did all the moving in every video. So each video started with one object in the centre of the table and three possible target locations. So in the first part of the video, I think Sarah moves the object into one of those locations, and then in the second part of the video, she moves it into one of the other two boxes, either when the observer was present or when they were absent. So basically setting up true belief and false belief conditions. We also manipulated predictability of the belief reference by playing around with the target object. So the target object was either predictably related to the first container that was used in the transfer, so the container that becomes the belief box in the false belief trials, or it was predictably related to the unused distractor box that was just sitting on the desk. So again, at the end of each video, participants were presented with the sort of still frame from the end of the video, and they heard through their headset a description of what will happen. So in this case, Jane will look for the, in this case, camera or soap tablets in the container on the left, middle, or right. So again, we're interested in looking at people's predictive eye movements towards one of these boxes, again, to see whether they can use perspective to make predictions. Okay, so this time we tested a total of 80 participants, half of which were passive observers, so they literally just looked and listened and answered comprehension questions between trials, and half of them were what we call active participants. So these participants were given an explicit task during the experiment. They had their fingers on buttons on the keyboard, and whilst they were listening to this description, they had to press as quickly as they could work out which of those three boxes would complete the end of the sentence. Okay, so basically they were given an explicit reason to track the person's perspective throughout. So this time 24 experimental videos, so we basically crossed tasks, so whether they were active or passive, with belief and also this predictability and analysis stuff is all pretty similar. Okay, so what we've got then is, firstly this is the data for passive and then active participants here, and hopefully what you can see is that there is a main effect of belief throughout the time series. So basically significantly different visual biases when there had been a true belief versus when there had been a false belief. So again, more evidence that people are spontaneously sensitive to other people's perspectives. When we looked at the strength of these biases, what we found was that participants were significantly biased or significantly predicting the reality box in the true belief trials just throughout the whole time series. They had no problem. And just very slightly later, so from the onset of the object, in the false belief conditions. So again, they seem to be very good at predicting other people's behaviour based on their false belief. The interesting thing was that we also had an interaction between task and belief. So as is very clear in these graphs here, the strength of the predictive bias towards the belief box and false belief conditions was much, much bigger in the active participants, so when they were given an explicit reason to track the other person's perspective compared to the passive observers. So importantly then, the active participants were actually starting to predict the false belief continuation straight away from look for the, whereas the belief in the passive observers didn't actually show a predictive bias towards the belief location until they'd actually heard that location in the auditory input. I should also just point out that this difference though did remain significantly different even in this passive group. And in the true belief trials, the strength of the bias towards the reality box was identical between the two groups. We also had some early effects of predictability where basically if there was a low level association between the object and the container, then it did strengthen the bias in the early moments of processing towards the appropriate belief box, but it was very short-lived and it didn't actually sort of affect much. Once these sort of higher level processes have kicked in, it seems to have sort of tailed off.
So when you do these analyses,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm assuming that. So I've not seen this. I mean, I've seen the visual world kind of analysis. I know these are based on that, but how do you decide, like, where you'll look for your effects? So, if, for example, you did all your ANOVAs after you'd had a look at these two graphs, you would kind of go, okay, I'm going to look there, I'm going to look there. I'm not suggesting that you did that, right? No. I'm just saying that, then it would be really dead clear to you to go, okay, that's what's going on there. It's essentially post hoc is what I'm saying to you, right?
Well, I mean, I do it a priori because I say in advance I'm going to use word-based regions analysis, which allows, so I say, I mean, just about all my studies, in fact, the only one that I haven't done that one with was the very first experiment I talked about false belief, and actually with that one we used K-means cluster analysis, where it's a statistical analysis that finds the best fit of your clusters. But I use this basically so that I can say from the onset of here is when they're doing it, and we identify the individual onsets and offsets of every word. And the statistical analyses are conducted basically on a trial by trial.
On that segment of
exactly, on that trial that's individual for each segment. So we know when I'm talking, I mean this is obviously average just for plotting, but for the stats, when I talk about during the object, that's during the object for every trial.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so we can also then look at the active participants, their behavioural data, because obviously they were pressing buttons, so we actually know explicitly how they did in this task. And what we find then is that there was a main effect of belief where participants made more errors, higher error rates in the false belief conditions compared to the true belief conditions. And we were able to split this down into the three different sorts of errors they could make. And you can see that most of the errors, just about all of them, it's egocentric. So they're responding according to their own perspective. It's not that they're being confused by these sort of semantic associations between objects and boxes, and every so often some stupid participants just press something. You just obviously mispress. Okay, so we can also look at reaction times. Again, we had a main effect of belief, so not only were participants slower in the false, made more errors, but they were also slower to respond in the false belief conditions than the true belief conditions. And these are all healthy adult participants, I should say. Okay, so this is the pupil diameter. So I guess one thing that we found was that there was a group effect. I guess the group effect I would take with a bit of caution because there's so much individual variation in pupil diameter anyway. But it does seem that pupil diameter then is larger in the active group. There's also a significant interaction between belief and task, which is that, again, false belief conditions lead to a bigger pupil diameter than true belief, and that's particularly so in this active condition. So I guess that's where I don't know what they would be doing randomly with movement that would account for, I guess, what I would expect.
Did you counterbalance the left and right stuff? Whether it was, whether you must have done because it was so tablets and.
The location of the objects, yeah, and they all, did exactly the same.
Well, I don't know about your interaction.
This belief effect's not significant in the passive group when you look at it individually, but it is significant here. So that's why there's a task by belief interaction.
You infer that that's a high cognitive load, is that?
Yeah. Yeah, so bigger pupil diameter means bigger cognitive effort.
So why is it a higher cognitive load in the active than the passive?
Because they're actually doing it, right? That's how I would sort of interpret it. They're actually having to think to make sure they press the button. I mean, they've got actually quite a short time, really, to press the button. It sort of does feel quite hard to do it.
Right?
Yeah, and actually the reaction times to press it. So this is just obviously for the active group, but the time here corresponds in the auditory input to offset the object. So as soon as they've heard the object, they're pressing that button. So they are doing it quite quickly.
Yeah, sure. I'm not disputing it. And it could be that maybe your averaging captures it and it deals with it. I don't know, because it's a nice symmetrical task. Anything you get on the left, you get on the right, and vice versa. It's not that they're randomly looking around the scene or anything. So that could well do it. In which case, you've no problems. I'll still, if it was me, I'd still check it, right? But what I'm struggling is that interaction looks not like an interaction to me. I mean, I can see it's an interactive pattern, right? But those error bars seem pretty big relative to the effect sizes.
Yeah,
I know that the main effects are whopping, right?
Yeah.
But the interaction.
And actually, so we've actually run the analysis with both ANOVA and linear regression modelling. Both comes out in both. And actually, with linear regression modelling, you also get a three-way interaction between task, belief, and predictability.
Well, we look how tiny those effects are. They're really quite small. Right?
Yeah.
But
the difference is because this and
I believe the three-way interaction, because that one you can see that the interaction is not on the left side and the other on the right side.
Yes.
But the two-way interaction, that's really small.
I can't hardly see it.
I mean, obviously, I had to do it on this scale to fit both the
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I still talk about it because it's there and it fits what I would have predicted. So,
So would
sometimes you have to get these things out there to sort of find out if it's.
Would you have predicted that interaction then?
I don't know that I would have predicted an interaction with task, but I mean, I would have predicted a main effect of belief.
I absolutely buy that, but
The task thing, I don't know, but I don't know. Post hoc, I would say that it's because they're more engaged. It is more competent and demanding to actually have to respond. I mean, you can think there are maybe some people in this passive group who
what's the passive condition again? I've forgotten.
They're just listening and looking.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. And when the other ones have got to press the button.
Yeah.
Right?
So there's no effect of the fact that they just move their eyes around on pupil diameter, because that's not what if your task asks them to move their eyes, right, that will have an effect on pupil diameter undoubtedly.
So they're not being explicitly told.
So what I'm saying is that imagine that your task asks them in condition A not to move their eyes and in condition B to move their eyes, and that affects pupil diameter, your effect would actually just reflect the fact that they have to move their eyes and not necessarily change in pupil diameter due to cognitive load.
So I guess what I could look at then is in the different groups number of fixations, see if there are more fixations even, or the sum of fixation distance or saccade distances or something there. I don't really know.
If something like this, I would almost get a baseline per individual where you look at like what's their rest level, if you'd like, of their pupil diameter when they're still and when they're moving about, and then see what the difference is. Because it could be that there's quite a few.
That's pretty interesting. I mean, at least you got an effect, right? I mean, it's pretty bored if you didn't.
Exactly. And it's one of these things that sort of regains my confidence in using linear regression modelling for this sort of data if you get the same as in an alpha. So,
when you say linear regression modelling, what do you mean? Do you mean linear models?
yeah, totally. It's how expert I am in using them. Okay, so basically then to summarise then what we've shown, basically across all measures that we've used, implicit and explicit, it seems that taking someone else's perspective is cognitively effortful, so it's more difficult than just considering your own perspective. And what's really interesting in this study then is that the eye tracking data have sort of shown this distinction between this sort of implicit or sort of easy ability to take to infer someone else's perspective versus the more difficult and sort of active task of actually using it to predict other people's behaviour. So the fact that the passive group, they show the significant difference between true belief and false belief, but they're not actually predicting that other person's behaviour. We've also shown that the implicit task performance is improved when people are actively involved in tasks. So when we give them a reason to track the other person's perspective, they actually get better. And we have evidence then that people have these sort of simultaneous representations of their own perspective as well as the other person's. And we've also shown some evidence that the availability of low-level cues can help perspective taking, but only really in the very earliest stages of processing, and they sort of dwindle very quickly when these sort of higher level processes kick in. I'll probably only be able to fit this last experiment in. Okay, so in the next sort of task, I guess one of the issues that I sort of have with the false belief paradigm and other people have is that when you have to take part in a false belief paradigm, you've got this extra problem of having to infer someone else's perspective but inhibit something from your own perspective. So you have a direct conflict personally. So what I was interested in here was to look at theory of mind, perspective taking, when you don't have that internal conflict with your own perspective. So what we did in this study was that we devised a sort of novel paradigm, which we called a sort of secrets paradigm, which is where we sort of placed that conflict with the actual character themselves. So the conflict no longer remains with the participant. So to explain what we did, we had these stories that described people's sort of high-level desires and intentions. So in this case then, in the open condition, we had a condition where, for example, Tom is always telling people that his favourite colour is pink, so his explicit preference is pink things. So therefore, when he goes to buy a new car, it seems plausible for him then to choose to buy a pink car. In contrast then, we had a secret condition where he doesn't want anyone to know that his favourite colour is pink, and in that case then, when he goes to buy a new car, he deliberately chooses a different coloured car, right? So the crucial thing then about this secret condition is that the facts are always the same. So his favourite colour is always pink. The only thing that changes is his sort of high-level preferences and desires, either to keep that secret or to let everybody know about that.
Isn't it odd that Tom would find the colour pink to be his favourite colour?
I mean, I guess this is just one of many examples, but I guess that we could have said any colour, but
Well,
I
just
think it's quite
how some
salient.
people process the information, because to them that might be
Yeah,
an odd thing in itself.
yeah. But then I guess we used it because we were sort of, I mean, Tom doesn't want anyone to know his favourite colour is green, so this seems a bit odd, I suppose, and not wanting to know anything about pink. And, I mean, as I say, this is just one example. We had all sorts of ones in there about, I don't know, somebody didn't want anyone to know their love of junk food, or somebody didn't want people to see their legs, and so they buy shorts or trousers, and all sorts of different things. Okay, so in this paradigm then, it was a sort of more traditional visual paradigm with just having sort of less naturalistic scenes, I guess, along with these videos and pictures. And so basically they hear a context sentence, so they either the open or the secret context, and they get a 1 second preview, and then it's followed by the target sentence whilst they're looking at these images. So what we're interested in looking at is whether people anticipate reference to either the sort of deception referent or the reality referent. Okay, So basically what we have here again, it's centred around 0, so any positive scores show bias towards the open reference, so in this case the pink car, anything down is the bias towards the green car, so the secret reference. And what we found then was that Anna revealed that there was a main effect of context, so basically significantly different visual biases in the open and secret conditions, practically all the way through the time course. And when we looked again at the strength of these biases, what we find is that the bias towards the open reference in the open condition was significant in just about all of these regions. In contrast, in the secrets condition, the bias towards the secret reference only became significant from the onset of chose. Okay, so I guess best to point it out here. So, I mean, that's quite interesting that they should do that, because it's almost like maybe they're waiting until they get this information about intention, and so the intention information comes from this verb here, deliberately. And so you have to know whether he's going to, you know that he maybe has this conflict, but you need to know how he's going to behave using this verb here. So basically, in the next experiment, what we were trying to sort of pull apart was 3 different possibilities that might explain this effect.
Hang on just one second. So it shows.
Yeah.
How do you get the bias there, right?
Yeah.
That's where it's showing up, but they don't know what it's. They don't know that. What are you going to say?
What they have heard by then is last week he went to buy a new car, so they know it has to be one of the 2 cars. So he deliberately chose.
I think he deliberately chose not to buy a. So you don't.
That's
So
true.
even if you negated it could completely flip it around, but I assume they'll just be assuming that it's going to not be a negative, right?
Yeah.
Or
I mean,
chose
we
to
do
buy a
in the next
screw or
experiment I'm
something.
going to show you, we do flip it around,
Yeah.
but not with negation. But yeah. So basically the next experiment, what we were trying to do was to sort of put apart whether this sort of slightly delayed anticipation in the secret condition is it just because theory of mind generally is more difficult, so it just is a bit slower to come about? Is it that people are waiting for these perspective cues that might come from verbs like deliberately, so it might explain the sort of action that they perform? Or it could even just be low-level semantic relations, so the fact that pink was mentioned in both the contexts actually pulls the bias up towards the pink car even regardless. So basically what we looked at was then we changed the intentionality verb. So rather than saying that he deliberately chose the pink car or the green car, we said now it was surprisingly chose. So in this case then, if he is always telling people his favourite colour is pink, it would be surprising he chose a different coloured car, whereas if he doesn't want anyone to know, it would be surprising he chose a pink car. So the idea is then by changing these intentionality adverbs, that we can actually flip the effect so they predict the other way around, that they really are using perspective. And that's basically exactly what we find. So we find that from surprisingly offset, there's a main effect of context, so they're doing significantly different things within these different contexts. And in this case then, in the open condition, participants are significantly predicting these green cars and the secret reference, and only very slightly later, so again from the offset of chose in the secret condition. So they're basically able to be very flexible with their predictions and update it according to the linguistic input, so using things like adverbs. And maybe they picked up the fact we never used negation. It's too difficult. That's a different experiment. Okay, so I guess to summarise what we've shown then is that having privileged information about someone else's intentions or desires can influence the expectancy effects that you have about their behaviour. And again, it doesn't seem to be that there's too much interference from reality. It seems though that both these possibilities are available because people are able to flexibly go between each of them given the sort of ongoing linguistic input, so they can sort of switch their predictions about other people's behaviour by sort of quickly accessing both of these representations that they have. So in terms of these sort of questions about theory of mind inferences, whether they're difficult or delayed, I think what we show here is that actually they're not necessarily sort of slower, they're not necessarily harder if you have the appropriate linguistic context that guides people towards the appropriate interpretation. Okay, so at this point I was going going to go on to conversational implicative, but that's a whole different thing. So I'll just skip straight through and just go to my conclusion. It's 10 past, so sorry. Okay, so basically what the sort of take-home message would be is that from all this research that I've been doing, so perspective clearly influences the time course that people are able to incrementally interpret language when they're understanding other people's behaviour, and what I would have shown in the other one is also in conversation as well. So we've been able to distinguish between a sort of spontaneous sensitivity to other people's perspectives, which basically means that people are aware that other people have different perspectives, and they do treat them, they treat these two things in different ways. But there is a more controlled use of actually how that alters the expectations that people have, so these explicit expectations or anticipations about their behaviour. We've got sort of growing evidence really that perspective taking can be cognitively challenging, and particularly in cases where you need to inhibit some knowledge from your own egocentric perspective. But there are lots of cases where you can predict other people's behaviour without any sort of difficulties. So, for example, if it's based on shared experiences, and also when the linguistic or contextual cues guide you towards the appropriate perspective inference. So, I'll just say thank you to my collaborators, and thank you for listening.
Any questions?
Do you get the same perspective effects for visual information and linguistic information if you have those separately? So if you're just shown something and had to take on the perspective of someone else, or if you read something you had to take on the perspective, would you predict that you'll get the same pattern?
I have no idea, it's a good question. I mean, what I can say is that during my PhD I tried many times to do false belief reading tasks, so people reading narratives that involve false beliefs, to look at sort of integration difficulties when it went against the false belief, and it never seemed to work. I don't know, I guess my sort of prediction is that, or my inference from all this stuff is that actually perspective taking is all about generating expectations about other people's behaviours.
Because you did say earlier on that you got the same brain networks active for visual as for linguistic information. Is that right? Or you said for theory of mind tasks?
Theory of mind tasks, not necessarily visual ones,
right.
But any task that involves, so literally they would put people in the scanner and say, I don't know, think about how your mum would describe you. So they're not necessarily visual tasks, they're just general. There's a whole range of tasks that evoke sort of social networks.
I misunderstood that because I kind of thought about what you said there, that actually you would expect the same networks to be active regardless of whether people were entering or engaged in perspective taking in a visual or
so some of those are visual, some of those are auditory, some of them are literally just lie in the scanner and think about it. And the linguistic tasks, they're mostly reading, but some are auditory as well.
Yeah, I guess if it's a fundamental thing though about intentions and expectations, then she should get it across different modalities.
Yeah, I would say.